Cal Pruitt ate his supper standing up. He had done it for 14 months. Ever since the second evening after the funeral, when he sat down at the long pine table out of 40 years of habit and found he could not stay. The chair scraped loud in the empty kitchen. The room went the kind of quiet that has weight to it, so he carried his plate to the counter by the sink and ate there, watching nothing through the window. And he had eaten standing every night since. A man who sat at the head of a table had earned something to show. That was his father's line, spoken once when Cal was 9 and never taken back. Cal believed it the way a boy believes the seasons. Now there was no one across from him and no one at the foot. Only the glass and the dark settling over 60 acres of bluegrass that not one soul in Harrow's Bend wanted to buy. The grass was the whole trouble. It had been good pasture once. Back when the Pruitt dairy ran 90 head and the milk truck climbed the gravel twice a week. Then came the winter of '91 and the milk price fell through the floor and stayed there. Cal sold the herd in March and the equipment in April. Somewhere in between, he sold a piece of himself he never could name afterward. The bank took the back 40. The town took its own quiet measure of him and filed it where he could feel it but never reach it. He was the man who lost the farm. In a place like Harrow's Bend, that was a thing you stayed. On the table behind him under the salt cellar so the draft would not carry it off, sat a letter he had read 4 times and answered none. It came on heavy paper, the kind a man buys to make small things look large. Craneland Holdings, it said across the top. Below that, in the careful type of somebody paid to be patient, an offer for the whole parcel. House, outbuildings, and what the letter called the unimproved acreage. 1,100 an acre. A number low enough to be an insult, and high enough that a tired man might take it just to be done. Del Crane had been making the trip out for 2 years now. He always came at the hour when a person was likely to be home and unlikely to have the heart to argue. He spoke soft and looked at the ground when he talked. Cal had decided that was the most honest thing about him. It meant even Del knew the price was wrong. Cal scraped the last of the beans into the trash and rinsed the plate. Through the window, past the dead garden, the old carriage house stood black against a sky going to plumb. 2 stories of limestone at the base, gray board above, a wide door below for a wagon to pass, and a loft door up top, set high in the gable where a block and tackle had once hung. That loft door had not opened in 40 years. Vera had seen to it. She nailed it shut the first autumn they were married, and chained it besides, with a padlock the size of his fist that had long since rusted to one piece. When he asked her why, that first year, she said the floor up there was rotten and she would not have him falling through it. He believed her. Believing your wife is easier than not. When he asked again, 10 years on, she gave the same words in the same order, and he understood the question was closed. 40 years he let it stay closed. She had been a careful woman about most things, and a locked door about that one. A man learns where the soft ground is in a marriage and where it is not. The loft was not soft ground, so he mowed around the carriage house and patched its roof. He never put a ladder to that upper door. In time he stopped seeing it at all, the way you stop seeing a hill you have lived your whole life beneath. Now Vera was 14 months in the ground at Bethel Church. The door was just a door. Cal dried his hands on the towel by the stove. He stood a while in the dark kitchen, listening to the house tick and settle the way old houses do when the heat goes out of the day. He was 70 years old. He had no herd, no wife, no children near enough to call it children. He had an offer on the table from a man who would not meet his eye. There was nothing left in this place that belonged to anybody but him, except the loft. He found himself in the mudroom without deciding to go, pulling on his coat against the October cold. He took the long flashlight from the shelf and the pry bar from the nail where it had hung since he gave up fixing fences. The metal was cold straight through his glove. Out the back door the night smelled of cut hay gone over and the first frost coming. The frost was early this year, 3 weeks ahead of what the almanac had promised, which in that county meant a hard winter, and everybody already knew it. The grass was wet against his boots. The wagon door below was swollen in its frame, and he had to set his shoulder to it. When it gave all at once, the way a stubborn thing does. Inside, the dark held its breath. His light found the wagon bay first, swept and bare, the dirt floor packed hard as a road. Then the stairs along the north wall, narrow, the treads were to a shine in the middle. He had been up them maybe twice in his life, to store a thing and to fetch it back. He went up now slow, one hand on the cold stone, the bar in the other, his shadow thrown huge and crooked up the steps ahead of him. At the top was the loft door, seen from the inside this time, chained and barred just as it was without, and beside it, set into the loft's own wall, a second he had forgotten was even there. Plain board, a simple latch, no lock at all. He stood before it with the bar in his hand and the cold creeping up through the soles of his boots. 40 years she had kept him from this room. 40 years he had let her. Now whatever was the truth of it lay behind a board door a child could open. Cal Pruitt found that his hand was shaking. He could not have said whether it was the cold. He lifted the latch. The hinges had been oiled. That was the first thing he understood. He stood in the doorway with the flashlight beam stopped dead in front of him, like it had run into a wall. The hinges did not creak. They had been oiled and oiled recently by a hand that used this door long after she told him the floor was rotten and the room was closed. The beam climbed slowly up the dark. It found a workbench first, long and heavy, its top scarred and stained, worn pale in two places where a body would have stood. It found tools racked above it on a board, each in its own painted outline, each hung in its place. It found a forge in the corner, cold now, the brick gone gray, a leather apron, stiff with age, on a peg beside it. It found shavings on the floor, curled and dry, swept toward the corners but never quite gotten out, the way shavings never are. Then the beam went up and back. Cal stopped breathing. In the center of the loft, on a low cradle of timber, stood a carriage. Not a wagon, not a cart. A carriage, light and fine. 4 wheels, tall and slender and red as a held breath, the body black and curved like something poured rather than built as. One side gleamed where the varnish had been brought up under a careful hand. It was half-size, was bare wood, sanded smooth and waiting. It was half-finished and wholly fine, and it had sat here in the dark above his head for as long as he had been a married man. He did not understand what he was looking at. He moved into the room the way a man moves on river ice. The floor was sound under him. No rot anywhere, the boards swept and solid. He came to the workbench and set his lead down so the beam threw everything sideways into long shadow. He put his bare hand flat on the wood. It was cold, but it was not strange to him. It smelled of linseed and iron and old smoke. It smelled, he realized, of her hands. The way her hands had smelled when she came in late from what she called the garden. The smell he had never once thought to question. On the bench lay a tool he had never seen. A small wheel of iron, no bigger than his palm, mounted on a forked handle so the wheel could turn. Around its rim were filed marks, tiny notches, a scale of some kind. The handle was worn dark and smooth where a thumb had ridden it 10,000 times. He picked it up and turned the little wheel with one finger. It spun true and silent, oiled like the hinges, kept like a thing that mattered. He did not know it was called a traveler. He did not know a wheelwright used it to walk the rim of a wheel, counting the distance around so the iron tire could be cut to that exact length and no other. He only knew it fit his hand as though it had been waiting for it. He knew the smooth, dark place on the handle was the shape of a thumb, and he knew the thumb had not been his. Cal stood in his dead wife's secret room with her father's tool in his hand. For the first time in 14 months, he did not feel alone in the house. He felt watched, not unkindly. The way you feel watched walking into a room where somebody has just been, this chair still warm, and you have only just missed them. He stayed up there until the flashlight went amber and began to die. Then he came down the worn stairs and crossed the wet grass to the dark house. He did not eat standing at the sink that night. He did not eat at all. He sat at the long pine table for the first time in 14 months. He set the little iron tool under the kitchen light. He turned it over and over. He tried to make it tell him what his wife had been doing all those years. Behind a door she swore was closed. It would not tell him, tools do not. But somebody in this county would know what it was. Cal decided, watching the first frost silver the window glass, that he was going to find out. Harlan Doss had run the lumber yard at the edge of Harrow's Bend for 51 years. Very little came or went in the county that did not pass at some point under his eye. He was 83 now and came in 3 mornings a week to sit by the stove and let his grandson run the saw. He claimed he came for the work. Everybody knew he came for the talk. Cal found him there a little after 8, in the chair that had molded itself to him, a cup of coffee gone cold in his hand. "Pruitt," Harlan said, and looked at him a long moment. "You don't come to town." "No," Cal said, "I don't." He set the traveler on the counter between them. Harlan looked at it and did not touch it. His face did a thing Cal could not read. A kind of settling the way a pond settles after a stone has gone all the way down. "Where'd you get that?" Harlan said. It was not a question. My loft, where it came from, is what I'm asking you. The old man picked it up then, both hands careful. He turned it under the window light, ran his thumb over the worn place on the handle, and something moved behind his eyes that was very old. This is a traveler, he said. Wheelwright's tool. You roll it round a wheel rim to measure the iron. He set it down gentle as an egg. Haven't seen one in 50 years, maybe more. I know she did, Harlan said it simply. The floor of the conversation dropped out from under Cal. You knew. I knew she bought lumber off me for 40 years and never told me what for. Harlan turned his cup in his hands. Quarter-sawn white oak mostly. Hickory for spokes when I could get it true. Ash. She'd come in near to closing, pay cash loaded herself, wouldn't let me carry a board, said she had a project. He looked up. I always figured you knew, a man's own wife. No, Harlan said slowly. I see that now. Cal stood with his hat in his hands in the lumber yard where he had bought nails for 40 years. He learned that the whole county had watched his wife build something in plain sight. The only man who never saw it was the one who slept beside her every night of his life. Quarter-sawn oak, Harlan was saying. You couldn't buy it cut that way at the box stores. The grain ran true and the wood didn't cup. It was what the old wheelmen used, because a wheel had to hold against 100 years of mud and stone and weight. Vera knew the difference. Vera had asked for it by name. Her daddy, Cal said, Asa, he worked wood. Asa Hollis was the last wheelwright between here and Lexington, Harlan said. Made carriages. Then they made cars, and nobody wanted a carriage. A man with a trade in his hands watched it die while he was still young enough to use it. Harlan shook his head. He drank some toward the end. People talked. You know how a town is. Cal knew how a town was. He had a town's opinion of himself folded under a salt cellar at home. Vera never spoke of him, Cal said. No, Harlan said, I don't expect she would. He took up the traveler again and pressed it back into Cal's handsprings, closing the old fingers over it like he was returning something stolen. You take care of that, he said. Man spent his whole life learning what that tool knows. Wasn't a thing wrong with him a little respect wouldn't have fixed. He sat back. She must have loved him fierce. To keep his trade alive 40 years and never tell a soul, even you. Cal drove home the long way. Past the church, past the bank, past the field where the dairy barn had stood before it came down. The frost had not lifted by noon, which it should have, which meant the cold was setting in to stay. Up in the loft, with daylight coming gray through the cracks in the board door, she saw the room properly for the first time. There was more than the one carriage. Against the far wall under canvas stood the made shapes of others, finished or near it, 3 of them, 4. Wheels hung from the rafters in pairs, true and tight, the iron tires blued with heat. A shelf held jars of varnish and pots of paint, brushes standing bristle up in a coffee can. There was a row of chalk marks on the beam over the bench, dozens of them, grouped in 5s, and Cal never did learn what she had been counting. Her reading glasses lay folded on the bench where she had set them down. The leather apron on the forge peg was cut small, taken in at the straps, sized for a woman's shoulders by a woman's hand. Tacked to the wall above the bench, where she would have seen it every time she lifted her eyes, was a photograph. Curled at the corners. A man in a leather apron, standing beside a carriage wheel that came to his shoulder. Asa Hollis. He had Vera's eyes exactly. He was not smiling. But he was not the broken man the town remembered either. He stood the way a man stands beside work he has done well. Proud and tired and sure. Cal looked at his dead father-in-law a long time. Below the photograph, tacked with a single brass pin, was an index card gone soft and brown at the edges. The writing on it was not Vera's. It was a man's hand, blunt and sure, the letters pressed deep enough to feel from the back of the card. How to true a tire, it said across the top, and below in steps. Roll the traveler round the felloes. Count the turns and the part of a turn. Mark the iron at that exact length and not a hair over. The hot band must come out shorter than the wood by the breadth of 3 pennies, no more, for it has to want to close. Heat it even, or it goes egg-shaped and shames you. When it sits down on the wood, it will scorch and smoke, and you will think you have ruined the wheel. You have not. Quench it before the wood takes fire. It draws down hard as the grip of a hand, and the wheel is one thing now, and will stay one thing for 100 years. Asa Hollis had written that for somebody to read after he was gone. Cal understood the somebody was Vera. He understood she had read it 10,000 times. He held the card under his thumb, the way the worn place on the traveler had been held, and he understood she had done every word of it out here in the dark. while her husband slept 400 feet away and called himself a man with nothing left. He set the card down and took up the traveler from the bench. He carried it to a finished wheel leaning against the wall. The way the card said, he set the little iron rim against the felloes and rolled it. It clicked as it turned. Each notch on the scale was a measure, and they went by under his thumb, and he counted them without meaning to, the way she must have counted. Once around the rim, the wheel stood as tall as his chest. He had driven a tractor over ground gone to iron and pulled calves in the dark and buried a wife. He had never once made a thing that would outlast him. This wheel would. It would still roll 100 years after the last soul who remembered Vera Pruitt was gone. He stood there with the traveler against the rim, and his hand would not move it on. A board settled somewhere below. The frost ticked in the gable. Cal Pruitt, who had not wept at the funeral because the town was watching and a man holds himself, put his forehead against the cold wood of his wife's last wheel. He stayed that way a while in the gray light where nobody could see. Then he looked at the half-finished carriage, the bare side waiting for varnish. The side that had waited since the night Vera's heart stopped in the kitchen, and she never came back up these oiled and silent stairs. Whatever she had been doing out here, she had not finished it. She meant to. Something had been left undone in this room, the same as it had been left undone between the two of them. Words she never said, a door she never opened. Now both were his, to do something about or to leave shut forever. In the corner, behind the forge, his light caught the edge of a cabinet he had missed in the dark. Plain wood, 2 doors, a drawer below. The drawer had a lock. It was a small brass lock, modern, the only new thing in a room full of old ones. Cal knelt in the shavings and tried the drawer. It would not give. He sat back on his heels in the cold gray light and looked at that one locked drawer in the room his wife had kept from him for 40 years. He thought, with a tiredness that went all the way down, of course there was one more door. He did not have the key. He did not look for it that day. But he marked the place in his mind, the way you mark where a thing fell in deep water. He went down the stairs and across the grass. That night he ate at the table again. He left the kitchen burning over the little iron tool long after he had gone to bed. The lock gave to a screwdriver in the end the way small locks do. Cal told himself a man had a right to open a drawer in his own house, even as the wood splintered around the screws. He felt like a thief anyway. He felt it the whole time. Inside the drawer were ledgers, 3 of them cloth-bound, the spines soft with handling. He carried them to the bench and stood where she had stood, in the worn pale place on the floor. He opened the first to the first page. The date at the top was the spring of 1985. It was a record of work. Every wheel, every carriage, every repair, set down in Vera's small upright hand, the hand he knew from grocery lists and Christmas cards, the hand that left a note on the counter the morning she died, telling him to thaw the chicken. Dates, materials, hours, and beside each finished piece a name and a sum, a buyer in Lexington, a collector in Cincinnati, a museum in Louisville that had taken 3 carriages over the years. The last one for a figure that made Cal sit down on the bench's edge before his legs did it for him. She had been selling them, all of it. For 40 years she built carriages in the dark and sold them quiet, cash and check both. The numbers marched down the page and across the years. They added up to a sum Cal could not hold in his head. He read backward through the years the way a man wades backward out of a rising creek, careful, watching the ground he had already crossed. A pair of wheels for a fellow over in Paris who wanted them under a wagon his grandfather had driven to church. A full restoration for the Louisville Museum, 11 months of work, the figure written small, as though the size of it had embarrassed her. A child's pony cart in the fall of '89, sold cheap, near to given away, to a name Cal did not know. 3 words sat in the margin beside it in Vera's hand, her boy is sick. That was all. Her boy is sick, and a price lower than the work was worth. Cal sat with the ledger open across his knees and understood that his wife had been a whole person out here. A person who made her own small mercies and kept her own counsel. A person whose life ran alongside his for 40 years, close enough to touch, and never once touched it. He turned to the back of the 3rd ledger, where a man keeps his accounts. He found a single sheet, folded twice, a bank statement, a savings account at the farmers and merchants in town, an account he had never heard of, never seen, never signed for. The name on the account was his own. Calvin R. Pruitt, $287,000 and some odd cents. 40 years of carriages sold in secret, every dollar put away under his name and not hers. in a bank a quarter-mile from the house, while he ate his supper standing at the sink and called himself the man who lost the farm. Cal sat on the bench in the cold loft and did not move for a long time. When the feeling came, it did not come the way grief had come. It came sideways, and it came wrong. He had loved his wife 40 years and buried her 14 months ago. Now he sat holding proof that she had kept a fortune from him. Hidden money, hidden work, a whole life lived 400 feet from his back door. And the first thing that rose in him, to his own shame, was not wonder. It was the old low question that comes to a man who has been left out of things. Why didn't she tell me? What did she think I would do? What kind of man did she take me for, that she would build all this and hide it, and never give me the chance to? He stopped himself, he made himself stop. But the question sat there in the cold and would not leave. And under it was an older one he had carried since the winter of '91. The one the whole town had asked with their eyes and never their mouths. Maybe she hid it because she knew. Maybe she looked at the man who lost the herd and decided he could not be trusted with anything that mattered. Maybe she built her father's trade in secret because she would rather do it alone than watch him fail at it too. That was the thought that drove him out of the loft. He could not stay up there with it. He drove to the farmers and merchants. The next morning, the bank statement folded in his shirt pocket. He stood in line behind a woman buying a money order and a boy cashing a check from a hay-hauling job. When his turn came, he slid the paper across to the teller, a young woman he did not know, and asked if the account was real. She typed a moment. Her face did not change, which was its own kind of answer. "Yes, sir," she said. "It's been open since 1985. Sole holder, Calvin R. Pruitt." She looked up, polite, a little puzzled. "There's a note on the file. Statements were to be held at the branch, not mailed. By the account holder's request." She started to turn the screen toward him, then thought better of it and turned it back. "Was that you, Mr. Pruitt?" "No," Cal said. "That was my wife." He did not explain. There was no way to explain it that would fit across a teller's counter. He thanked her and walked out into the cold morning. He passed the men drinking coffee at the diner window, the ones who had known him 40 years and watched him lose the farm. He thought how strange it was to walk past them now. He had been a man of some means the whole time and never known it, and the not knowing had been the gift she meant to give him. He could not work it out. He went home and ate nothing. He thought once about calling Wade. His son was 44 now and lived outside Cincinnati, where he had gone the spring after the herd was sold. They spoke maybe twice a year and said nothing either time. Wade had been 19 when the farm came apart. Old enough to watch it happen, young enough to need somebody to blame, and Cal had been standing right there. He picked up the phone and held it and set it back down. There was no way to begin. "Son, your mother built carriages in the loft for 40 years and left me a fortune I didn't earn." Those words would not go down a telephone line to a man who had stopped believing his father could be trusted with anything. He set the receiver in its cradle. That was a door for another day, if it was a door at all. That night he sat at the long pine table with the traveler in front of him and one lamp burning. He turned the little wheel with his finger and listened to it spin true. He thought about the smell that came off her hands all those years, when she came in late from what she called the garden. Linseed and iron and old smoke. He had thought it was the dirt, the compost, the kerosene she used on the tomato beetles. He had kissed those hands and never once asked. A man does not ask his wife to account for the smell of her own work. A man is supposed to know. He sat there a long while. The frost came up the glass. Out past the dead garden, the carriage house stood dark over everything she had not lived to finish. He took the ledger to town the next morning, to the only person he could think of who might tell him the truth of what he was looking at. Not what he feared. The Louisville Museum had a name written beside it 3 times across the years. A curator who had bought from Vera. Cal called the number from the phone in his kitchen, standing up. A woman answered. When he said his wife's name, there was a silence on the line he had learned to recognize. The silence of somebody who knows more than you do. Her name was Beth Calloway. She drove out from Louisville 2 days later in a small car with mud already on it. A woman of maybe 50, reading glasses pushed up in gray hair, a way of looking at a thing that took the whole thing in at once. Cal led her up the oiled stairs and stood back. He watched her stop in the doorway the way he had stopped, the way everybody must stop, and put her hand to her mouth. "Oh," Beth said, "just that, oh." She walked the room slow. She did not touch the carriage, at first. She crouched by a finished wheel where it leaned against the wall and ran her fingers along the felloes, the curved sections of the rim, where they met. She tapped the joint with a knuckle and listened. She put her eye to the line of the spokes and sighted down it like a man sighting a rifle. "These spokes are dished," she said, half to herself. "You see that?" She set them so the wheel cups a little outward, just so. A dished wheel carries a side load the straight one can't. Most people don't even know to do that anymore. The ones who know don't do it this well. She stood and laid her palm flat against the iron band that bound the rim, the tire that held the whole wooden wheel from flying apart under load. "And this," she said, "feel how tight that sits." She'd have heated this iron in that forge till it ran near white, cut it short on purpose, then dropped it down over the wood while it was still glowing, whole wheel screaming, smoke pouring off it. She tipped her head, remembering a thing she had only read about. Then water, fast, before the wood caught fire. The iron shrinks as it cools and pulls every joint in that wheel closed at once. She rapped it with one knuckle. It gave back a clear, bell-bright note. No glue in a wheel like this. No screws. Just wood cut true, and iron that wants to come home. That ring is how you know it took. A loose tire goes dead. This one still sings. "My wife did that," Cal said. He needed to say it out loud. "Vera, she made these." Beth looked at him, and her eyes were wet, and she did not pretend they were not. "Mr. Pruitt, I bought 4 carriages off your wife over 15 years. I dealt with her by mail and by phone. And one time in a parking lot in Frankfurt because she wouldn't let me come to the place she worked. I thought she was a man." She laughed, a small, broken sound. "Every appraiser I showed them to thought she was a man. Some sold fellow who'd learned the trade as a boy. I'd have bet my job on it." She shook her head. "A woman did this out here, alone." She crossed to the half-finished carriage in the center of the room, the red wheels, the one bright side, the one bare. She stood before it and was quiet a while. "This is the best thing she ever made," Beth said finally. "I can see it from here, the proportion, the line of the body." She reached out and stopped her hand an inch short of the wood, the way you stop short of touching a sleeping child. She didn't finish it. "No, why not?" "Her heart stopped," Cal said, "down in the kitchen. November before last, she was making coffee." He found he could say it plainly here, in this room, in a way he never could to the women at the church. "She came out here every night. I thought she was in the garden. 40 years, and I never knew." Beth Calloway looked at him a long moment, this stranger in his dead wife's secret room. Then she said the thing that turned everything over. "Mr. Pruitt," she said, "she didn't hide this from you. I don't think you understand yet what you're standing in." She gestured at the bank statement still on the bench, his own name on it in black and white. "A woman who wants to hide money doesn't put it in her husband's name. She put it in yours. She wanted you to have it. She just didn't want you to have it yet. I have spent 14 months thinking I was the last thing she had to be ashamed of." It came to Cal in his own voice, plain and unguarded, the way a true thing comes when you have stopped guarding against it. It was the closest he had come to the center of the matter since he forced the door. "Then why the lock?" he said aloud, his voice rough. "Why the chain on the loft? Why 40 years of a closed door if it was all for me?" Beth did not answer right away. She was a careful woman, he could see that. Careful the way Vera had been careful. She would not hand him a soft answer just to ease him. "I don't know," she said. "I didn't know her like you did. But I'll tell you what I know about people who do work like this in secret." She put her hand flat on the bare side of the carriage. "They're not hiding the work. They're hiding the reason. The work a person shows eventually. The reason is the locked drawer." Down behind the cabinet, where Cal's light had not reached in 3 visits, there was one more thing he had not found. Beth found it. She pulled the cabinet from the wall to read the maker's marks on a frame stored behind it, and her hand came back with an envelope. It had slid down into the gap and lodged there. Yellowed, the flap sealed, no stamp. One word on the front in Vera's small upright hand, Calvin. Not Cal. Not the name she had called him across 40 years of mornings. His whole name, his Sunday name, the name she used only twice that he could remember in all their life together. Both times when she had something to say that could not be unsaid. Beth held the envelope out to him across the bench. Across the bare wood and the silent forge and the carriage their 2 hands had nearly touched. Cal Pruitt looked at his own name in his dead wife's writing and did not reach for it. Not yet. He was 70 years old and he had forced one door already today. He understood, holding her gaze as across that cold and crowded room, that this was the one that mattered. He understood that nothing on the far side of it could be taken back once it was read. His hand came up slow. The frost had still not lifted. It was past 3 in the afternoon, and the light through the board door had gone the color of pewter. Somewhere down the gravel road a truck was slowing, turning in, its tires loud on the stone. "Del Crane, come again at the hour a tired man is likely to be home." Cal did not hear it. He had the envelope in his hand. Beth Calloway knew when a room had stopped being hers to stand in. She set her card on the bench beside the bank statement and the sealed envelope. "When you're ready to talk about what becomes of these," she said, "you call me." Not before. She looked at the half-finished carriage one more time. The way you look at a thing you are not sure you will see again. Then she went down the oiled stairs. Cal heard her car start, heard it pause in the yard, heard it pull away slow. He was alone with the envelope and the truck coming up the gravel. He went down. Del Crane stood by the wagon door with his hat in both hands the way he always stood, looking at the ground. He had watched the strange car leave. His face held a question he was too careful to ask. "Mr. Pruitt," Del said, "I hope I'm not calling it a bad time." "You always call it a bad time, Del. That's the job." Cal said it without heat. He found he had no heat left for the man. "There's no bad time anymore. There's no time at all. The land is not for sale." Del nodded, slow, like he had expected it and only come to be told. "Can I ask what changed?" Cal looked at him a long moment. Then he stepped back from the door and held it open. "Come up. You drove out here 2 years running. You ought to see what you were buying." He took Del Crane up the worn stairs and stood him in the doorway of the loft. He watched the developer stop the way every soul stopped, the offer drained out of the man's face. Something plainer came up behind it. Del did not speak for a while. He walked to the red carriage and looked at it and did not touch it. He looked at the wheels and the rafters, the cold forge, the chalk marks on the beam. "My granddad drove a wagon to the tobacco floors," Del said finally. His voice had changed. The patient salesman had gone out of it, bought it second session off a man over in Bourbon County. He always said it rode better than anything you could buy new. Said the wheels never went out of true. He turned and looked at Cal. Hollis, that was the name. He'd talk about that man like he was somebody. He was, Cal said. He was her father. Del stood a while longer. Then he took the folded offer out of his coat, the new one he had brought. He did not hand it over. He set it on the bench face down beside Beth's card, and he pressed it flat with 2 fingers. It was an oddly gentle thing for a big man to do. "I buy land off men who've quit," Del said. "That's the whole of it. I find the ones the town's done with. I make them a low number and most of them take it because they're tired." He looked at the carriage again. "I won't come back out here, Mr. Pruitt. You haven't quit. I can see that now." He put his hat on. "I'm sorry it took me 2 years to look up." He went down the stairs. Cal heard the truck turn in the yard and go. He never saw Del Crane on that road again. Then the loft was quiet. The light through the board door had gone to ash. There was nothing left between Cal Pruitt and the envelope but his own 2 hands. He did not open it right away. He stood at the bench a while in the worn, pale place where she had stood 10,000 nights, and he was afraid. He had spent 14 months learning to live with a Vera who was gone. Now there was one more Vera, waiting inside a sealed flap, a Vera who could still speak. He understood that once he read her words he could never again pretend he did not know them. A man can carry a question a long way. An answer he carries the rest of his life. He turned the lamp up. He worked his thumb under the flap, careful, the way you open a thing you cannot reseal. He drew out 3 sheets, covered close in her small upright hand. He read. "Calvin," it began. "Calvin, if you are reading this, then you have done the one thing I asked you not to do, and I am glad of it. I always meant for you to. A woman cannot tell her husband to wait 40 years for a thing. She can only build the thing and trust him to find it when he is ready. I have trusted you a long time, longer than you knew. You will think I hid this from you. I want you to put that thought down. I did not hide it. I kept it. There is a difference, and you of all people will come to know it." Cal lowered the page. "I did not hide it. I kept it." He read the 2 lines again. He thought of all the evenings she had risen from the supper table and said she was going out to the garden, and how she had touched his shoulder every time on her way past. A hand laid flat between his shoulder blades for the length of one breath. He had thought it was only her way of leaving a room. He understood now that it had been a thing said. For 40 years she had been telling him something with her hand that she could not yet tell him with her mouth. He had felt it every night and never once read it. He lifted the page and went on. My father made wheels, she wrote. You never met him. He was gone before you came courting me. The town will have told you he was a drunk, and toward the end he was. They will not have told you why. He made the finest carriages between here and Lexington. Then the world decided it did not want carriages anymore, and told him so every day for 20 years until he believed it. I watched a good man be talked into nothing. I was a girl and I could not stop it. I swore over his grave I would never again stand by while a man I loved was told his life was worth nothing. Cal set the letter down on the bench and put his hand over his eyes. He was remembering the coat. There had been a work coat she kept, brown duck canvas gone soft and pale at the cuffs, far too big for her, a man's coat from another time. She washed it by hand twice a year, spring and fall. She hung it on the line though she never wore it, then folded it away again in the cedar chest at the foot of their bed. He had asked her about it once, early on. She had said it was her father's, and the way she said it closed the subject, the way the loft door closed it. 40 years that coat hung on the spring line, smelling of soap and cedar. Cal had walked past it 1,000 times and thought it was only a thing a widow's daughter keeps. He had not understood that she was keeping the man, that every wash was a refusal to let the town's verdict be the last word over Asa Hollis, and that out here, in the dark, with the man's own tools, she had been refusing it harder than any coat could. He understood now why she never let him drive her to the lumberyard, why she paid in cash, why she carried the boards herself. She was not hiding a business. She was guarding a resurrection. He picked the letter back up. His hands were not steady. He read on anyway. Then the winter of '91 came, she wrote, and the herd went, and the town looked at you the way it once looked at my father. And you began eating, stand it succinct, Calvin. You thought I did not see. I saw all of it. So I went out to the loft where his tools still hung and taught my hands what his hands had known. It took me 3 years to make a wheel that would not have shamed him. I sold what I made and put every dollar in your name, because the money was never the point. The point was this. One day, when you were certain you were nobody, you would open a door and find proof. Proof that a woman's had spent her whole life building on the strength of you, that you were the ground I stood on, that a man this town threw away was worth 40 years of work in the dark. Cal read that paragraph 4 times. He had buried the herd selling so deep that he had stopped feeling the edges of it. Now it came up whole. The March morning the cattle truck came. The way he had signed the papers in the kitchen, then walked out to stand in the empty milking parlor where 90 head had stood at dawn for 30 years. He had thought he stood there alone. He saw us now that she would have been at the window. She had watched her husband break in the cold and said nothing, because there was nothing a wife could say in that hour that would not make it worse. And then, instead of saying, she had gone out to a loft and begun. In silence, she had built him a way back the town could not take and the bank could not touch. A way back that even her own death could not stop. She had not pitied him. Pity he could not have borne, and she had known it. She had done the one thing pity never does. She had bet her whole life that he was worth it. He turned to the 3rd sheet. Here her hand grew smaller, the lines closer as though she had been tired when she wrote them. Or pressed for time. Or both. The doctor told me in the spring of, but you had just lost the herd, and I could not. The line broke off there in the middle, the ink trailing where she had lifted the pen. Below it, after a space, she had written one more thing about it. I will not finish that sentence. Some things a person carries alone, so the one she loves does not have to. Cal sat very still. He read the broken line again, the dash, the space, the thing she had chosen not to say, and he understood slowly the way cold comes up through a floor, that she had known, not at the end, years before the end. In some spring she would not name, a doctor had told her a thing. She had walked out of that office and looked at a husband who had just lost everything, and she had decided he would not also lose the comfort of not knowing. She had spent her own dying the way she spent her nights, quietly and on him. All those evenings he thought she was tired from the garden. All those mornings she rose gray and said it was only her age. She had carried it alone the whole time, out to the loft and back, so that he would never look across the supper table and see a dying woman where his wife used to be. There was a last part. He almost could not read it. Finish the red carriage, she wrote. The off side wants 2 coats and a week to cure between them. The traveler will tell you the tire. You know more than you think. You have watched me without knowing it for 40 years, and the hands remember what the heart was too busy to learn. You were never invisible, Calvin. I only never found the words while I had the breath to say them, so I left them where they would last, in oak and in iron. Your wife, Vera. Cal Pruitt put the letter down on the bench. He did not weep the way a man weeps when something breaks. He wept the way dry ground takes a long rain, slow and all the way down and without any sound to it at all. He wept for the herd and for her father. He wept for the 40 years of evenings he had let her walk out into the dark alone. She would have given anything to have him beside her at that bench, if only he had thought to follow. He wept most of all for the simplest thing of it. She had loved him in a language he never learned to read, and she had died before he opened the book. He sat there until the lamp seemed the only warm thing in all that cold, dark country. Then he folded the 3 sheets along the creases she had made in them. He put them in his shirt pocket, over his heart, where a man keeps the thing he means to carry. He looked at the red carriage a long time, the one bright side, the one bare. "All right," he said to nobody to her. "All right then, I'm coming." It took him the better part of a year. He was 70 years old. His hands had pulled calves and strung wire and signed away a farm, but they had never once held a varnish brush. The first coat he laid on the offside ran in 3 places. He had to sand it back to the bare wood and start over. The second coat ran too. He sat down on the cold floor of the loft and cursed in a way he had not cursed since the cattle truck. Then he laughed at himself and tried again. By the 4th try he had it. Load the brush light, lay it long, and never go back over stroke once it was down. Asa had a card for that too, tucked in the stack behind the first. "Varnish like you mean it and then leave it be," the old man had written. "A thing fussed at never dries true." He found the rest of the cards that winter, a whole pack of them behind the first, soft and brown. The old man's blunt hand had laid out a lifetime for a daughter not yet born when most of them were written. How to season a fellow, how to read the grain before you cut, how to tell a horse's gait from the wear on a hub. Cal read them all by lamplight, slow, the way you read a letter from the dead, because that is what they were. He came to feel he knew Asa Hollis better than half the men he had sat beside in church for 50 years. Pressed flat in the back of the last ledger he found a photograph he had not seen before. A girl of maybe 7 stood in the shop in a dress too good for the place, her hair in plaits, her father's hand resting on her shoulder. Asa was not smiling. The girl was not either. She had her chin up and her eyes on the camera the way a child stands when she has been told to hold still and means to do it right. It was Vera. She had grown up in the smell of linseed and hot iron. The trade had never been lost to her at all. She had only set it down for 40 years, the way you set down a thing too heavy to carry while your hands are full of other griefs. Then she had picked it up again the night the cattle truck pulled away, and taught her grown hands to remember what the girl had watched. Cal pinned the photograph to the board beside Asa's, where she would have seen them both at once if she were here to lift her eyes. The work filled the cold months the way the herd had once filled them. There was always a thing to do, and the thing did not care how a man felt while he did it. That was the mercy of it. Some mornings he climbed the stairs heavy with the missing of her and came down at dark, having forgotten, for whole hours at a stretch, to grieve. He did not feel he had betrayed her by the forgetting. He felt she had arranged it. She had left him a year of work because she knew a year was about how long a man needs his hands full so his heart can mend underneath them. He moved a chair and a lamp up into the loft, then a cot for the nights he worked late and could not face the long dark walk to the house. He kept her bench exactly as she had left it. Her reading glasses stayed folded where they lay. He did not move the apron from its peg. He came to think of the loft not as a secret he had broken into, but as a room he had finally been let into. The way you are let into a person, slow over years, sometimes only after they are gone. He learned the work the way she said he would. The hands remembered. He had watched her cross the dark yard 10,000 evenings, and without knowing it he had filed 100 small things away. The smell of linseed and hot iron, the rhythm of a sanding block, the tired, satisfied set of her shoulders on the nights a thing had gone right. Now it came up out of him like water out of a struck rock. He would reach for a tool before he knew he needed it, and find his hand already closing on the right one. He understood, in a way that brought the ache up fresh each time, that the reaching was hers. She had stood in this place and made this motion until it wore a path in the air. His own body could still follow it. Spring came late and wet that year. The black locust along the lane bloomed in May, 2 weeks behind. The loft grew warm under its tin roof in the afternoons, and Cal worked in his shirt sleeves, the board door propped open to the green light. There was the matter of the last wheel. The carriage was one more, the near front. She had cut the spokes and set the felloes before she died, but never bound the iron. That was the part Cal had dreaded since the day he first read the card on the wall. The tire setting, the fire. It was the one job in the whole trade where a year of patient work can be lost in the space of a held breath. One failed nerve, one measure off by a hair, and it was gone. He waited for a long day when the light would hold. He rolled the traveler around the bare oak rim, the way Asa wrote and Vera did. He counted the notches under his thumb. Then he counted them again to be sure. He cut the iron band short by the breadth of 3 pennies, no more because it had to want to close. He built the fire up in Asa's forge until the brick glowed. He laid the band in the coals and turned it until it ran the color of a sunrise, even all the way around, no part of it cooler than another. He was afraid the whole time. He was afraid he would ruin the last thing she had left for him to do. He lifted the glowing band with the long tongs and dropped it down over the wood. The oak screamed. White smoke poured off it in a sheet. The loft filled with the smell of scorch, and every nerve in Cal's body told him he had set his wife's last wheel on fire and lost it. He did not believe the card. He believed his eyes, and his eyes said ruin, but he made himself wait the 2 seconds the old man's hand had told him to wait. Then he doused it, fast, and the water hissed up in a cloud. The iron began to cool. As it cooled, it drew. It drew down hard as the grip of a hand. It pulled every joint in the wheel closed at once, spoke and felloe and hub, into one single thing that would hold against 100 years of road. When the steam cleared, he rapped the rim with a knuckle, the way the museum woman had. It rang clear and bell-bright and true it sang. Cal Pruitt stood alone in the loft with his dead wife's last wheel ringing under his hand, and he laughed. Once, out loud. A sound that startled him in the quiet, a sound he had not made in 2 years. Then he took up the traveler from the bench and rolled it around the new tire, slow, though there was no need. He had only wanted to feel the little wheel turn one more time, in his own hand, in the worn place where her thumb had ridden the handle smooth for 40 years. He hung the traveler back on its nail, in its painted outline where it belonged. Beth Calloway came out in May when she heard the carriage was done. She walked around it 3 times and did not say a word that Cal could hear. At the end of the 3rd turn, she took off her reading glasses and cleaned them on the hem of her shirt. He had learned that was the thing she did instead of letting a man see her cry. "It's better than the 4 I bought off her," she said. "It's better than the one we've got standing in the lobby." She looked at him. "You finished it." "She finished it," Cal said. "I only held the brush. The museum took it in the fall." Beth had wanted one for the long, bright hall for years, but Vera would never let a name go on the work. Not hers, not her father's, not anybody's. The carriages had gone out into the world labeled to some nameless old man. Every appraiser who ever handled one had pictured a bent fellow in a barn who learned the trade as a boy. Cal told Beth to set the record straight at last. He did not want his own name large on it. He wanted hers, and Asa's, the 2 of them together, the way it should have been from the start. So the card beside the red carriage was made to read this: built by Vera Hollis Pruitt of Harrow's Bend, Kentucky. In the tradition of her father, Asa Hollis, wheelwright. Finished by her husband, Calvin. A few people from town drove up to Louisville for the opening. Cal had not asked them to. They came anyway, in their church clothes, the same people who for 30 years had carried a quiet verdict on him and on the Hollis name before him. He watched them stand in front of the red carriage and go still. He watched the verdict leave their faces the way it had left Del Crane's. Nobody said much to him. There was not much to say. But Harlan Doss, who was 84 now and should not have made the drive, gripped Cal's hand hard at the door and held it a beat too long. That said the thing the town did not have words for. The morning they set the carriage out, a girl of about 9 stood in front of it a long time, holding her grandmother's hand. She wanted to know how the wheels were made. Cal stood at the back of the hall in his good shirt and listened. A young docent told her about the iron and the fire, and the woman who had worked alone in a barn for 40 years and let no one watch. The girl looked at the red wheels as if they were a thing out of a story. She asked whether the woman had any children to teach it to. The docent said she did not know. Cal did not tell anyone in that hall who he was. He only watched the child look at the work. That was enough. That was the whole of what Vera had wanted. He understood at last. Not to be famous, not even to be thanked. only to be seen one time by somebody young enough to carry the thing forward into a world she would not live to see. He drove home in the early dark. The first hard frost was coming again. Early again, 3 weeks ahead of the almanac, the way it always came in that country. He let himself into the quiet house and stood a moment in the kitchen with his coat still on. He did not eat standing at the sink. He took down a plate and filled it. He carried it to the long pine table. He sat down at the head of it in his father's old chair for the first time in 2 years. The room was still too quiet. The chair across from him was still empty, and would stay empty, and he had stopped pretending otherwise. But a man who had earned something to show had a right to sit at the head of his own table. His father had told him so, once when Cal was 9 and believed it the way a boy believes weather. He had made a thing now, with his own 2 hands, that would outlast him. In the dark, the way she taught him. He set the traveler on the table beside his plate, where a man keeps the thing he means to carry. The phone rang once that winter that mattered. It was Wade calling from outside Cincinnati, his voice careful the way a man is careful on ice he does not trust. He had seen a thing in the paper, yes, he said, a carriage in a museum with his mother's name on it. He did not know what to say about that, so he asked instead how his father was keeping. They talked about the weather and the early frost and the price of nothing in particular for 11 minutes. Wade did not come home that winter. He did not say he forgave his father for the herd and the years that came after it. Some sons never find that road, and Cal had made what peace he could with not being handed a thing he had not earned. But at the very end, before he hung up, Wade said he might bring the children out in the spring, to see the place, to see the loft. He might, he said. He did not promise. Cal set the phone down and did not let himself build anything on it. A door left open is not a door walked through. But it was open, which was more than it had been in 15 years. A man learns to be grateful for the difference between a shut door and one left only ajar. The carriage house still stood at the edge of the empty land. Only the land had never been empty. Cal understood that now, walking out across it, in the blue evening, the frost coming down and ringing faint in the dead grass. For 40 years he had looked at 60 acres of bluegrass and seen the measure of everything he had failed to keep. He had been wrong about the land, the same way he had been wrong about himself, and for just as long. The worth of the place was never in the soil, or the grass, or the price a tired man might take for it. It had been in the woman who crossed it every night, carrying her dead father's tools and her own stubborn faith. Building in the dark a thing she trusted her husband to find. On the day he had decided he was no one at all. He had never been invisible. He had only never been shown what she was building in the dark. Cal climbed the worn stairs. He lit the lamp on her bench. He took down the traveler, rolled it once around the rim of the next wheel, and set to work. There's a tool in this story called a traveler, a little iron wheel on a handle used to measure another wheel, to walk all the way around the edge of a thing and count it true. I keep thinking about that. How a person can spend 40 years walking around the edge of someone they love, measuring them, knowing them, and still leave one drawer locked. I won't pretend I know what Vera should have done. Maybe she was right to keep it. Maybe a gift means more when it's found than when it's given. Or maybe she just ran out of time the way most of us do, with the important things still unsaid. Harrow's Bend isn't a real place, and Cal and Vera aren't real people. I changed the names. But somebody you know has a locked drawer, and so do you, and that part is as real as it gets. So here's the question I'm leaving on the bench, next to the lamp. What are you keeping that you mean to give later? And are you sure you'll get the chance?